Yeah, we're good. Okay, we have students.
Do you want to check the mic just in case?
No, we just did.
Oh, we just,
Yeah.
okay. Okay, cool. I think we should be fine.
Okay.
And the screen you shared? Yes.
Uh,
You're sharing. the
That's
screen,
fine.
Right?
Yeah,
Okay,
screen
cool.
shared.
Next slide should be the slide.
Okay, perfect. And then we just keep going into the. That's so great. Is it all in one? It's great. Okay, yeah. Okay. Okay, we're gonna start. Thanks, everyone. Welcome, everyone. My name is Uwe Brandis. I'm the faculty director of the Georgetown Global Cities Initiative, and I just want to offer my sincere welcome and gratitude to all the students and faculty who are here for the 5th annual Student Research Summit. We've been doing this summit for 5 years as a way of creating a space for students across the university to come together and share their research, share the kind of ideas and the thoughts that they have, that they're advancing in their academic work in a kind of a safe setting. And one of the things that we'll see today, and I'm just so excited about all the presentations, is that there'll be multiple perspectives, there'll be multiple disciplines expressed. And that is really exciting for us because, as we know, when you walk down the street in a city, when you sit down with a citizen of a community, it's really hard to talk to them about just one thing because they're experiencing life in cities in a way that is so multidimensional. And so it's that interdisciplinary approach that we're going to celebrate here today. I just want to say a couple of really short things about the initiative. What's the big deal? Why are we doing this? What is the big deal? For about 10 years now, we've been living in a world where more people live in cities than in rural areas. And within the time frame of your professional lives, for the next 30 to 40 years, we're going to see another quarter of the world's population living in cities. What an extraordinary transformation that is. And so, you know, we're looking at a future where, you know, if we agree or with the population models of the United Nations, where we have about 3/4 of the world's population living in cities. So cities is a tough issue to ignore. You really just can't get around it. And so we're going to celebrate that here today. One of the other huge trends associated with urbanization is a rising and growing middle class. And why that becomes important is if you think about people's lives and the manner in which they make discretionary decisions about how to organize their day, how to employ themselves, how to you know, be stewards of friends and family. These are discretionary decisions that have huge impacts, not just in social and economic terms, but also in material terms, in terms of how cities are organized and how they work. And so this is just an enormous issue that we celebrate within the Global Cities Initiative. And we're going to have so many excellent insights today from your work. We have 2 faculty here right now. I just want to very quickly introduce them. Professor Robin King, you can wave. Exactly, who's from the School of Foreign Service, and Professor Chris Zimmerman, who's from the Urban and Regional Planning Program. I'm not going to do extensive introductions, nor are we going to do extensive introductions of the students right now. I would just ask the student presenters, when you come up, just introduce yourself and what program you're in. I just want to pause right now and acknowledge Paul Ivetsky and Suan Choi, that we would not be here without their work. They've done an amazing job organizing us and bringing us together. And I just wanted to thank both of you for amazing, amazing work. And so with that, I just, kind of want to acknowledge that there'll be faculty coming in and out. We'll have food arriving shortly. We have poster presentations. We have an awesome agenda. And without further ado, let's kick it off with the first panel. Josephine, come on up.
I'm setting a timer for myself. My name is Josephine Kim. I'm a second-year magic student, second-year GGCI scholar. This is my first time presenting my research at this summit. So here we are pulling in to Rovaniemi, which is a city I've been studying on paper for a very long time. And finally, I'm seeing it in person this past summer. So this project is my master's capstone thesis. This presentation is more of the context for that. So it's going to be a snapshot. Here is the outline of today's presentation. Some of these I'm going to have to really breeze through. So welcome. This is Rovaniemi, the official hometown of Santa Claus as of 1984. The tourism actually began as early as the 16th century. So there was clearly more to see, more to know about Rovaniemi than just Santa Claus, even though he takes up a lot of space in the imagination in marketing today. I began very simply. This was very difficult to answer though, as a student of history. Looking at different people's perspectives, different sources will all lead you to different answers. And when thinking about when to start my project and where to end my project, thinking about that temporal scale, that geographical scale, depending on where you shift it, you can hide cause and effect relationships. Sometimes the effect is the cause and so forth. So I felt very troubled and I found it very challenging. And I have always been a fan of the long view of history, but I needed to have some tools to begin. So even though I read a lot of the scholarship, the most helpful was going there in person and talking with local historians, archivists, librarians, going on very long city tours that were amazing. I have so many maps and photos, it's ridiculous. This is like 0.5% of it. I also borrowed from other disciplines such as ethnic studies, anthropology. This is one concept I took from sociology, which helps me look at power dynamics post 1945, so after World War II. And I'll talk more about what happened in the city, but it was completely rebuilt because 90% of it was destroyed during the Lapland War. I'll also be doing this very ambitious scope. This presentation will touch upon the national, international, indigenous, the local and regional. I don't have time to go into that, but I'm happy to take questions on that. And that's where the next steps of this project will be going toward. So what is the Arctic? I think in the last, okay. At the bottom, what's supposed to appear is, in scare quotes, modern Arctic city. And that's how scholars have categorized Rovaniemi. And I challenge this. Concepts of modernity, concepts of the Arctic, and concepts of the city. They can't be easily smashed together and essentialize a city. So I challenge this. So for context, what is the Arctic? These are some images that come to mind. They're all part of explorer mythology as far back as the 1500s. And A lot of these are based off of European travelogues and fictionalized experiences. Some of them are based off of real experiences. What was also supposed to be at the bottom right here was, is it something to preserve or is it an agent in it of itself? So where is Rovaniemi located physically? I talked a little bit about where it might be located in the imagination. But as you'll see here from a bunch of maps that I will show you, it's important to keep in mind that maps are cultural documents. They have been said to be, quote, a creature of time and space. So they also are very imaginative in a sense and require a lot of interpretation. This is a non-political map or an anti-political map. It came about in the 1970s when the Sami revitalization movement occurred. The Sami are Europe's indigenous population in the north, and about 100,000 still live today, about 8,000 in Finland. As you can see, there are no nation-state boundary lines. There are natural formations indicated and over 920 indigenous place names in the Sami language. The Sami people, I can't go into their amazing history at this time, but there's a lot of diversity even within the Sami people. But this map just shows a portion of the Nordic region. And it's useful to compare with this modern map or a more modern map. It has 3 timescales smashed into it. It's important to know that in this light gray area, that the first 500 years of Finland's history was Swedish history. They were part of the Swedish kingdom. And after the Finnish War, the Empire of Russia took it over. And it became, so it was part of the Swedish kingdom from the 12th century to 1809. And when Russia took it over, it was very special and it became an autonomous region called the Grand Duchy of Finland. Finland gained its independence in 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution. These 2 maps, I want to bring attention to Sapmi, which is one of the spellings of this indigenous homeland, and the Lapland region up there. So this is the nation state's perspective of this area. It is not recognized as the indigenous homeland, but rather a northern wilderness. You can see the indefinite boundary line. And Lapland stretches across 4 nation states. So this dark blue is the Finnish Lapland. And Rovaniemi is the administrative capital of Finnish Lapland, which is what I am studying. So note also the Arctic Circle line. It seems like a more dependable way to look at Rovaniemi because Rovaniemi territory is right on the Arctic Circle. Actually, that Arctic Circle line is imaginary. It shifts seasonally. It shifts even more because of global warming. It's based off of a scientific definition that describes ecological conditions, which are rapidly changing. I will not go over this timeline. It's very selective, but I want to highlight that this is in 1453, this is the earliest the word Rovaniemi has been used. Long story short, it was a seasonal trading post. It became a market town, but only became a city until 1960, which brings up the question, what if it functioned as a city before it gained that status? So that's why this categorization of the modern Arctic city is problematic. I also want to highlight Oliver Aalto. He was the modernist Finnish architect who helped replan the city after it was destroyed in World War II. His cultural capital has helped Rovaniemi gain another layer of status almost instantaneously. He helped rebuild a lot of municipal buildings, and his work is all around the world as well. This is the airport, very modern looking as well. 2 Finnish architects built that, and Santa Claus. These 3 things together are making up most of the modern visual identity of the city. This really takes up space in the city's image, and I want to know why and how it got to become so powerful. I'm going to try to breeze through this part. As I mentioned, the Arctic Circle. These signs they're the same, but this is Mrs. Roosevelt visiting on behalf of the UN. They donated a lot of money to help rebuild the city, and she's just checking in. She also had curiosity for the midnight sun and wanted to see reindeer and farming children, all these things. So her cultural capital made this sign into an example of objectified cultural capital. Santa Claus Village is built around the Arctic Circle line. So that line is running through the village. And the line's not actually along that white painted line. It kind of is everywhere. And so it's an example of how Santa Claus is able to tap into other power sources, imagination to make it real. And he's a non-human, yet he takes on flesh there through the marketing, through ideas that we take. Maybe that's contested because we take for granted things like the Arctic Circle. We think it's real as well. These are some stakes. I'm running out of time. These are to highlight the environmental concerns. This is something that's becoming more and more relevant. Rovaniemi, when I went there, was hotter than it's ever been in 5 years. It was sweltering, and there's a lot of floods, rising sea level, and forest fires. And I can't go into the dam and the railroad, but maybe you can take questions. This is a Sami child in class a couple decades ago. And I really want to talk about this, but I don't have time. So I'm very excited to take my next steps right here to say what's next. I am taking a seminar in global environmental history, and I've been learning about some concepts that might help me talk more about the local regional aspect. And one is path dependency. The other is urban metabolism. And I want to focus more on Kemioki, the river that you first saw in my opening slide, because it really has informed the industry in Rovaniemi and how it has changed over time from a gold rush town to being a salmon fishing place to an international hub to talk about the Arctic. But now that dam prevents those kind of industries, which has led to the implementation of the Santa Claus industry from the main capital, Helsinki. So there's a lot to that. Hopefully that didn't confuse you too much, but these are some other interests of mine. And I'll end it with the city library that Alvarado built. Thank you so much for listening.
Two presentations and then
I will do my best to compete with Santa Claus, but I don't know if I can. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Wright. I'm in my second year here at Georgetown. I'm in the Urban and Regional Planning program, and I'm going to tell you what I think cities are going to look like in the next couple of decades or so. Just to give you a brief overview of kind of how I got to my research question and what interested me in this topic in the first place, I'll take you through the past 2 decades of very generalized settlement patterns. So starting in the beginning of the century, you see this huge suburban boom. Everyone wanted a single family home, a yard, 2.5 kids, and a dog. And come 2010, the housing bubble bursts. People are freaking out because the market has crashed. And all these millennials are totally stuck and don't have any idea what to do with themselves, and are entering the workplace. And they are the biggest generation to enter the workforce since the boomers. So it's really causing this huge societal shift. And as we all know, in 2020, COVID hits, changes everything, upends our entire world. And along with a global pandemic, we also have a racial reckoning and a little bit of a reflection on who the city is for and who it benefits and who it doesn't. And today we're dealing with a completely different set of problems as we were in the beginning of the century. We are dealing with stagnant population instead of population growth. All sorts of rising costs of living, especially housing costs, and cities that are increasingly economically and demographically divided. So based on these trends, I came up with this research question. And basically what I wanted to answer with this was how we address these changing population trends and shift our momentum to what's happening now versus what was happening 2 decades ago. So a lot of our policies tend to be stuck on what was going on in the 1990s and the 2000s, and it's not serving us anymore. So what can we do differently? So to just take you back a few more decades, I think these population maps are pretty helpful to show the changes in urban growth over 50 years. So basically, you see that population growth is mainly in bigger cities during this time period. So cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, New York City, so pretty classic cities that you think of when you're thinking of population growth. From 2000 to 2020, we see a little bit of growth in these big cities that have hosted the majority of population growth over the past 75 years, but also in these smaller metro areas like Dallas, Phoenix, Indianapolis, Minneapolis. So you see these smaller metros start to pop up as well, along with the bigger cities. And this map on the right is from the UN, and this is the predicted US population in 2035. And you can see that there's really not much of a change, especially in the big cities. The little cities perk up a little bit, but I do want to point out that the change from 1950 to 2000 is pretty drastic. And from 2000 to 2035, it's negligible. So population is growing a lot slower than it used to, and it's going to stay that way. Moving on to migration. Migration is an important thing to study because it is the main driver of population change in big cities, not just in the US, but all over the world. So this map on the left shows you areas in the US with higher than average migration. And I define that as places that had in-migration of 5,000 people or more. So the smaller dots that you see are at that 5,000 in-migration number, and the larger dots have 8,000 to 10,000 people that in-migrated. And in-migration in this case means that the census tracked them and saw that they were living in a different city in a different state a year ago. So the map on the right shows the settlement patterns of boomers in the US. And I know people normally talk about millennials and how they're driving the real estate market and housing trends, but I want to talk more about the boomers in this case because they're huge. Their generation is going to overtake the rest of us very soon. So you can see that most of the boomers are clustered in and around major cities. I think we normally think of boomers as just snowbirds who flock immediately to Florida and to the south, but this map shows you that that's not necessarily the case, and that they likely want to be where their families and friends are, not just where it's warm. Just to harp on that point a little bit more, this shows all the current generations in one map. It's a little bit confusing. So the teal circles around the big cities are millennials, and you can see that they're clustering in places that are pretty predictable. And this is likely because millennials now are reaching middle age, likely peak of their career, making a lot of money, wanting bigger houses, more amenities, that kind of thing. The darker blue dots are the greatest generation, so pre-1945 and boomers. And you can see they're kind of everywhere. There's no real clustering of them other than in Florida and on the East Coast there. And then the lightest green, which is a little hard to see up there, is concentrated in the middle of the country. And those are the Generation Y kids. So that's where the majority of the population growth is happening in the country. So what factors determine urban settlement and population disbursement? Just to clear the elephant in the room, COVID has been said to bring about the death of the city and to bring about an end to urban life. I would say these claims are wildly overrated and facetious. But if we just look at the data here, this is a map of COVID trends per county from 2021, and it's normalized by population as well. So you can see that red strip in the middle is where counties are still experiencing a pandemic. And the lighter areas are those that are now in the end stage of the pandemic. And the lighter areas tend to be encircled in more urban areas. And the darker areas tend to be more rural and suburban. This isn't surprising to anybody. But this is all to say that COVID likely had no lasting impact on urban migration and settlement patterns. COVID was not the cause of depopulation in cities, and like many other systemic patterns, COVID just called attention to a blooming issue that was already happening. So overall, it's important to view pandemic population trends in the context of broader suburbanization patterns that have been at work in major cities since the middle of the 2010s. It's a shock to an ongoing system of change, of selective population dispersion that was established years before the pandemic. And it's one that generations of young adult movers may or may not follow. It's just hard to know. Another thing that determines where and how people live is affordability and cost of living. So this map shows housing and transportation costs as a percentage of income for median income family homes. So it takes your average households and figures out how much of their yearly income they spend on housing and transportation. And the darker areas are relatively less affordable. The lighter areas are considered relatively more affordable. I found this really surprising, partly because everybody's always talking about how expensive housing is in cities. But my theory as to why the darker areas are more suburban, so the more expensive areas are more suburban and rural, is because transportation costs are so high. So housing is expensive no matter what, but when you combine that with transportation costs as well, you have to drive everywhere, it's also expensive. Another way to look at this is through disposable household income. So this shows the brown tan areas of the country with households that have relatively less disposable household income. And then the teal areas have relatively more disposable household income. So the teal areas richer, brown areas relatively poor. And you can see that it shows similar trends to the other map, just in a different context. So flip the coin on its head. The teal areas here are mainly clustered around urban centers, but there's also large swaths of the country that aren't labeled at all. So they're just like breaking even, which I think is another important note here. But if you combine these to the previous one and this map, you see that 5 years ago, counties ranking above the 90th percentile in housing stress, which is housing costs as a share of income, excluding transportation, accounted for 1/3 of the nation's population growth. That's a lot. That's a lot of population growth in one sector of the economy. And that suggested that high prices represented high demand. The market was relatively in equilibrium. But in 2021, these same counties, so this is just 2 years later, were net population losers, suggesting that costs have gotten out of hand. And these trends stack up against the national economy, really in a way that's not surprising at all. Basically, cities contribute a significant amount to national GDP. Money is where people are, essentially. So those blue dots are contribution to national GDP, and the black dots are population. So bigger the dot, bigger the contribution or population. So obviously, climate change is nothing new. We're all familiar with it. Extreme weather and natural disasters are getting more frequent and more intense. This map on the left shows hurricane path trends in the right-hand corner. You can see them going all the way up to even Maine, which surprised me a little. And then these little dots in the left-hand corner of the map are earthquakes. And on the right-hand side, you can see heat severity mapping. And again, not surprising, these little heat severity pockets are clustered around urban centers. I will say, Pennsylvania is almost completely orange. I was really surprised at that, but that's because in 2021, they had a 4-degree change in their heat index, which is more than any other state in the country in the past century. Similarly here, drought conditions will continue to worsen. This is just predicted for the next year. Same with sea level rise. And what I take from these maps is that people continue to move to climate risky areas, and that it doesn't really matter if things happen or when they happen. If they want to be there, they'll be there. So thinking about what all of these things mean for the future of urban spaces. So what we normally think of when we hear the word suburbs is something like this on the left. You think of miles of pavement, cul-de-sacs, houses close together, you know, that 2.5 kids and a dog thing. And that's not to say that that doesn't exist in places in the country, but lots of suburbs are starting to look like what we see on the right here. So basically they're looking like that because people want urban amenities without having to pay the urban price. This map is a little technical and confusing, but it shows countywide migratory movements for each selected county. So you have Suffolk County near New York City on the left, Elko County, Nevada, suburban rural county on the right. And this suggests that from 2015 to 2022, people who already lived in proximity to big cities moved all over the place. And that suggests greater economic mobility and just greater choice in general. And this is supported by data because in 2019, the suburbs grew at an annual rate of 0.7%, while the cities grew at half that rate, which was 0.3%. And when you compare the more urban county to a more suburban county like Elko County, we see again that people moved there from urban areas. So you're not talking about people moving from suburbs to city usually it's cities to suburbs. Okay, so to summarize all of that information that I just threw at you, the suburbs are urbanizing. And like I said before, people want to live in urban places without paying the urban price. Big cities like New York City and LA have reached their capacity. They're getting richer, but they're getting smaller. And they can't host a variety of demographic and economic groups, and it doesn't really seem like they want to. Urban death does not equal urban struggle. Cities are living things that are constantly changing and shifting, and we just need to be able to adapt and shift with them. Population continues to grow in climate risky areas, like you saw in those 4 maps previously. Cities need to plan for steady state conditions, not continued growth. Much of our economic models are based off of a continued upward trajectory in economic growth, and that's just simply not happening. So we need to figure out how to be happy where we're at, essentially. This is my opinion, but I think we need to focus less on the young adult population and more on the aging population. They're huge, the generation is huge, they're staying where they are, and they have different preferences than they did 20, 25 years ago. So we need to really take a hard look at where they're staying and what they need. And lastly, scale matters when you're talking about these things. These are hyper-local problems with hyper-local solutions. All of these generalizations can be helpful for context, but if you're looking for hard, concrete solutions, then you really have to go on the ground. And I'll leave you with this quote. Urban shrinkage or depopulation is by nature a demographic phenomenon. City sizes evolve precisely because people move in and out, are born and die. Moreover, the demographic processes that contribute to the shrinking of cities, outmigration and death, are selective, and so they also govern who remains behind in cities as they shrink. That's all I have for you.
Wonderful, thank you. So we have 2 mics. Josephine, why don't you come up so that you can also participate in the conversation? And we chose these 2 presentations because they're so sweeping, but in different ways. And so we've invited Professor King to respond.
Okay, well, first of all, congratulations and thank you. They're really interesting papers. And like good papers, they bring up sort of more questions often sort of than they answer, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of them, and then I've got some specific questions. I mean, one of the things that I think was similar is how sort of, while Josephine sort of emphasized the historical sort of perspective, we saw it in some of the data that Megan was showing, right? And so we see that, and we see the importance of geography and time. Right. And so even in the data that you were showing on Pennsylvania, for example, I mean, to some extent, I would say that's probably sort of a figment of the administrative boundaries that we're using as much as anything else. Right. And that's something that we just need to be really careful about when we're looking at data, especially when we've got really hyper local challenges and we're trying to deal with local responses as well as sort of state level or national or sometimes international or sort of regional responses. This idea of sort of Santa Claus's home, like I'd never really thought about. And so, and it made me wonder, so I'm trained as an economist. And so it made me think, like, does this city go after other people that claim that Santa Claus lives there in terms of like intellectual property kind of way? Because lots of places all over the world claim that, right, in different countries. And so that like, that's probably irrelevant, but it's one of the kinds of things sort of that comes to mind. The idea of the Arctic as whether it's like something to preserve or an agent really made me wonder, and like it's one of these things I'll think about and as I'm waiting for the bus or on the bus or something. As we think about, and again, it gets back to geography though, a little bit, right? Because it is a geographic area, and how we think about those areas as well as how we define them don't always correspond, and the reality of them sort of don't always correspond like you should with that line that, you know, probably is a very big deal from a touristic perspective, right? With people taking their pictures sort of on that line. I also, I think that, and later we can talk some more about using the concepts of urban metabolism and then path dependence. Because like, to me, one of the reasons why you care about history is because of path dependence, right? And urban metabolism is a way to take some of that data in different ways and bring together different disciplines. And I think that both of you sort of were drawing on different disciplines and what you were saying, although sort of you were pretty rooted in your sort of in history or sort of in planning, right? And so that was quite interesting. Another similarity was really how climate change will affect sort of the future and the patterns that you talked about, whether you know the forest fires sort of change the way that city needs to be built or needs to grow, sea level rise, and then sort of in your data, you know, all of those people moving to places that are going to be subject or are subject now. I mean, it's not even in the future, it's now, right? In Miami, like that big teal circle, right, that just keeps growing despite the fact that it floods constantly, and you know, plus the hurricanes and sort of all kinds of things like that. So on the shrinking cities paper, one of the things I think would be really helpful is, I mean, we're in the US, but I teach in the School of Foreign Service, and so identifying that you're talking about the US is actually really important because there are other places that are going through the same kind of story, right? And so looking at Japan, that's further along sort of in that aging challenge, is something that, again, you don't need to do it for this paper or for your thesis or what sort of, but thinking about the future, certainly it would be helpful. I was also curious about immigration, right? You talked about migration, but immigration has been a huge driver of different patterns in the US and population growth. And while we're in sort of an anti-immigration mode at the moment, that may change, right? Because we also, from the economic perspective, we have worker shortages all over the place, especially to take care of all of those boomers that need care. So it would be interesting to see that. One of the things that I really loved was that you focused on housing plus transportation costs, because and for me, that's the way to think about it, right? Because it's not just housing, it's not just transportation, it really is the combination of those. The one big question I had is, you said people want to live in cities without paying the urban price. And I don't know what that really means. So I'd like you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So basically,
So that colleagues on the other side of the world can hear.
yeah, so essentially that was more in the urbanizing suburbs point. So one of the main reasons people have flocked to the suburbs is not only for more space and bigger houses and all those things, but because the housing is cheaper in the suburbs. And so you had these sprawling, cheap single family homes that initially attracted people, but then they were like, I have to drive 45 minutes and sit in traffic to get to work or to get to a coffee shop. And so developers swooped in some places, and we're like, hey, I can meet your needs if you agree to have a sidewalk put in here, and you could walk to your favorite coffee shop. And if you wanted to work remotely, then you could work remotely from that coffee shop. So that's essentially what I was trying to get at. And that's I think that's going to be a persistent pattern in the future. I don't think the sprawling suburbs that we've seen for the past 50, 60 years are going to remain like that because they're not serving the needs of people anymore.
One of the other things you mentioned that sort of the movement of people sort of to you sort of was a reflection of greater economic choice. And sort of from my look at the data, it isn't always because they want to move, but they feel they have to because that's the only way that they can afford to live, right? And so I think sort of balancing that of sort of the economic choice versus the constraints that people are facing, because again, sort of from an economic perspective, like this is part of the story, right? And then talking about the labor market is the other and what wages are and things like that. And so that would be like what I would say chapter 2 could be from this that I would be really interested in seeing. But in general, I thought they were really interesting. So thank you.
Can I mention one
Yeah,
thing?
please.
I'll just say that Rovaniemi is self-anointed official hometown Santa Claus, but also uncontested. The infrastructure that supports it is just so deep. There's a Santa Claus train that takes you there, Santa Claus airplane. They've got more, yeah, I don't think there are Santa Claus towns in the US, but they don't have a train. And I think the heritage of reindeer living in the area, as well as like folklore about Finnish Santa Claus, not the Coca-Cola one, but the mean Santa Claus exists. I think it kind of supports this imagination. Thank you.
So many questions. I know. So let me say first, Ms. Wright started her career at Smart Growth America last spring, just as I was ending mine.
Thank you, Chris, for hiring me.
And I spent most of my career there, it seemed like, trying to explain to older people why they need to be concerned about the younger people, to boomers, that they should be focused on millennials. So to hear the younger person tell me that perhaps we need to focus more on the older generation is interesting, and prompts a question which you don't necessarily have time to answer here, but I'll put out there, which is, so the reason for my side of that is the notion that the workforce is driving the economy, especially in the era of the knowledge economy. And so that was kind of the argument, was that you need to care about where young people want to be because they're driving everything. Their choices are going to drive what happens in the economy that matter a whole lot to whether people like me can enjoy our retirement, and other things. So I'd like to hear more, not necessarily now, but what I would hope you would elaborate on as you move forward on what it would mean to focus on that older generation, apart from the need to pay our bills. Because I think that's a real key too, especially if on your premise of it's a steady state, is that labor force, what does it mean? I think is a big question. I also like to leave a question for Ms. Kim, because I'm fascinated now with Rovaniemi, which I think I saw in a movie once somewhere, but other than that, everything I know I learned today. And I'm fascinated with the idea of this community tapping into this sort of global phenomenon that really is a real Western US driven cultural phenomenon, right? And on the one hand, I think it's very clever. And on the other hand, I also wonder, because you did talk a lot about the culture that's there, that's old and that most of us don't know anything about, right? And that is a separate culture from the West, and what the impact is of a community having to focus so much of, evidently, its economy around an idea that is so much not native. And I would think that that's a challenge on another level, beyond economy. But very interesting presentations. Thank you both.
And I just wanted to build on that. I think, Josephine, you presented a kind of a very interesting nexus of trends. And that is this population center declaring itself a city, or going through the process of governance whereby it's known as a city. This issue of kind of long history of cultural identity as kind of an indigenous and regional culture. And then the kind of third layer on that is this kind of introduction of Alvar Aalto and the kind of modern project of making functional cities. And so that kind of mix of those three is super interesting, I think. And as you further develop your project, I think there will be very rich insights associated with how the kind of modernist planning tradition or modernist planning project kind of layers on top of a sense of local identity and the formation of a city. So it's great. Thank you to both of you. Thank you for starting us up today. We're going to stay on time, and we have breaks where we're going to be able to mix and mingle and continue the conversation. So let's move on. Lucas.